The aroma of truffle rosado wafted through the luxurious restaurant La Magnifique. Every table sparkled with fine crystal, and laughter from the elite clientele filled the air. Tonight was like any other evening until the quiet buzz of whispers started. "Baron Trump is here," gasped a waiter, his face pale as he hurried back to the kitchen. The young son of the former president, surrounded by his security team, stepped into the restaurant like a scene from a movie. Head chef Olivier, renowned for his genius in the culinary world, glanced up from his stove. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath. His sous-chef froze. "What do you mean, chef?" asked Marco, wide-eyed. "I'm not serving him," Olivier said firmly, his voice calm but resolute. The staff stood in stunned silence. "Why?" asked Anna, the pastry chef. Olivier's jaw tightened. "I have my reasons." As Barron sat at his reserved table, his guards watching over the room like hawks, the tension in the kitchen became suffocating. The staff begged Olivier to reconsider. Guests craned their necks, murmuring in confusion as the minutes dragged on, but Olivier didn't budge, and with his refusal, a storm was brewing that no one could stop. The restaurant erupted like a shaken soda bottle. A guest nearby exclaimed, "He's refusing Baron Trump? Who does that?" Others gasped, their forks midair. "Chef Olivier," said Thomas, the maître d', approaching nervously. "You can't do this. His people are asking for their order." "I've made my choice," Olivier replied, wiping his hands with a cloth. "Inform them there's no service for him tonight." Barron, calm yet visibly confused, glanced at his phone as one of his guards leaned in to whisper something. The room grew quieter as more guests noticed the awkward situation. Behind the scenes, the kitchen was in chaos. "You're ruining us," Marco hissed. "This could destroy your career." "It's not about my career," Olivier said, his voice tinged with an emotion no one could quite place. Meanwhile, Barron's security team approached Thomas, their expressions unreadable. "Why has service stopped for Mr. Trump?" one of them asked. Thomas hesitated, his face drenched in sweat. I'll get back to you," he stammered, darting back into the kitchen. The tension in the air was suffocating, and nobody knew how far this would go or why it was happening in the first place. Inside the kitchen, Olivier's hands shook as he leaned against the counter. His staff didn't dare interrupt the silence. "Do you remember the protest 3 years ago?" Olivier finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "The one outside the Capitol." The question caught everyone off guard. "What does that have to do with tonight?" Anna asked. "I was there," Olivier admitted, his voice cracking as he added, "I lost my younger brother that day. Wrong place, wrong time. He was caught in the chaos." The room fell silent. Marco's spatula clattered to the floor. Olivier continued, "It's not Barron's fault. I know that. But every time I see his family's name, I'm reminded of the grief I can't escape." His eyes burned with unshed tears. The staff looked at each other, unsure of what to say. This wasn't just about refusing service. It was a man grappling with his own pain, but as Barron's guards returned, their steps heavy with purpose, the situation was about to escalate beyond anyone's control. Social media exploded within minutes. A guest had live-streamed the unfolding drama, and Baron Trump and La Magnifique trended worldwide. What kind of chef denies service to a kid? One tweet read. Others, however, rallied behind Olivier. "People have the right to take a stand, even in their own kitchen," another post argued. Inside the restaurant, guests whispered furiously, while some secretly recorded the commotion. Barron remained calm, quietly typing on his phone. Chef Olivier stayed in the kitchen. His team was growing anxious. "It's all over the internet now," Marco whispered, showing Olivier the flood of notifications on his phone. Olivier didn't flinch. "Let them say what they want," he replied, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. In the dining room, Barron's lead guard approached Thomas once more. "Our patience is wearing thin. Either we're served or we leave," he warned. The staff braced themselves, unsure what Barron would decide. Just then, Barron stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over the table. "I'll speak to him myself," he said, his voice steady. Olivier turned around as Barron stepped into the kitchen, flanked by 2 guards. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the appliances was the only sound. "Chef," Barron said, his tone polite but firm. "I understand you don't want to serve me. Can I ask why?" Olivier hesitated, his heart pounding. The entire staff froze, watching the interaction with bated breath. "It's not personal," Olivier said finally. "You've done nothing wrong, but I can't." Barron's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. If I've offended you in some way, I'm sorry." Olivier's hands clenched into fists. "It's not about you, Barron. It's about what your family represents for me. A loss I can't forgive, a pain I can't forget." For the first time, Barron looked genuinely affected. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. "But holding on to that pain forever won't bring anyone back. I came here to eat, not to make enemies." Olivier's breath caught. Something in Barron's words struck a chord, but the wounds ran deep. Could he really let go of his grief? The air inside the restaurant felt heavy. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why would he refuse to serve Barron Trump? One woman asked her husband. Even the staff huddled in a corner, their faces a mix of shock and fear. For a place that prided itself on elegance and grace, this was chaos. The Secret Service agents, dressed sharply in black suits, exchanged tense glances. They seemed unsure how to respond. Barron, sitting quietly in the corner with his hands folded, looked hurt but said nothing. "Is this personal?" one of the guests murmured loud enough for others to hear. The tension grew as whispers turned into accusations. People began speculating that the chef, known for his fiery temperament, had let his ego get the better of him. But no one could understand why Barron was the target. Just as the whispers turned into louder murmurs, the maitre d' approached Barron with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Trump, we're so sorry for the inconvenience. Perhaps we can offer—" Before he could finish, the chef stormed out of the kitchen, his voice echoing. "Don't offer him anything, not from my restaurant." The room froze. Barron looked up at the chef, his calm blue eyes steady. The boy said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. "Why?" one of the Secret Service agents demanded. "Why won't you serve him?" The chef, whose name tag read Chef Antonio, tightened his apron. His face was stern, almost angry. "I don't owe you an explanation," he replied coldly. Barron's guard stepped forward, but the young Trump held up a hand. "It's fine," he said quietly, his voice, though soft, carrying surprising strength. "We'll leave." "No, we won't," one of the restaurant's prominent guests said, standing up. "Chef Antonio, this isn't just unprofessional, it's cruel." Others began nodding in agreement. "I said what I said," Antonio snapped, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't understand my reasons." Barron stood adjusting his blazer. His tall frame and composed demeanor made him look older than his 17 years. As he walked toward the door, he turned to the chef. "Whatever you're going through, I hope you find peace," Barron said, his voice unwavering. Then he walked out, leaving the room stunned. Once Barron left, the whispers exploded into chaos. "That poor boy," an elderly woman said, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. "He didn't deserve that." Others nodded in agreement while some tried to defend Chef Antonio. "Maybe he has his reasons," one man offered. But no one seemed satisfied with that answer. Inside the kitchen, Antonio's hands trembled as he leaned against the counter. His sous chef, Maria, approached cautiously. "Chef, what was that about?" she asked softly. Antonio didn't respond. His face was pale, and his eyes were clouded with something deeper than anger. He finally whispered, "You wouldn't understand." Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Barron and his guards climbed into the sleek black SUV waiting by the curb. Reporters had already gathered, snapping photos and shouting questions. Barron ignored them, staring out the window. "Do you want to release a statement?" one of his guards asked. "No," Barron replied. His voice was calm, but his eyes glistened with unspoken emotions. "There's no point." That night, Antonio sat alone in his apartment. The city lights flickered through his window, but he barely noticed them. On the table in front of him lay an old photograph, wrinkled and faded from time. It was a picture of a young boy laughing as he held a soccer ball. Antonio ran his fingers over the image, his eyes filling with tears. "Why now?" he whispered to himself. "Why did he have to come here?" The knock on his door startled him. When he opened it, Maria stood there holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need someone to talk to," she said softly. Antonio hesitated, but let her in. They sat in silence for a moment before Maria asked the question everyone was thinking. "Why did you refuse to serve Baron Trump?" Antonio clenched his fists. "Because seeing him reminded me of everything I've lost." Maria frowned. "What do you mean?" Antonio's voice cracked as he replied, "He reminded me of my son." The next morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Every major network covered the incident with headlines ranging from Chef Antonio Sparks' outrage to Baron Trump's grace under pressure. Antonio woke to dozens of missed calls and messages. Some were from friends, others from strangers hurling insults. He ignored them all. At the restaurant, Maria tried to manage the backlash. Customers canceled reservations, and the staff worked in uneasy silence. Everyone wanted answers, but Antonio remained tight-lipped. Meanwhile, Barron sat in his hotel room scrolling through the news. Despite the overwhelming support he received online, he looked sad. One of his guards approached cautiously. "Are you okay, sir?" Barron nodded, but didn't speak. His mind was elsewhere. Back at the restaurant, Maria finally confronted Antonio. "You can't keep this bottled up," she said firmly. "If you don't tell your story, people will only assume the worst." Antonio sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he said, "but it's not a story, it's a tragedy." And with that, he began to tell her about the son he had lost and the scars that never healed. Antonio stared at the photo of his son, his hands trembling. "His name was Luca," Antonio began, his voice barely audible. "He loved soccer, pasta nights, and he had this laugh that could light up a room." Maria listened intently, her heart heavy with each word. "I wasn't there for him when he needed me the most," Antonio said, his eyes glistening with tears. "I was too busy building my career, too busy chasing dreams to notice my own son slipping away." Maria's voice was gentle. "What happened to him?" Antonio took a shaky breath. "Luca got into an accident. He was riding his bike to meet me at the restaurant. I had promised him dinner after work, but I was running late. Again, he didn't make it." Tears streamed down Antonio's face as he gripped the photo. I blamed myself for years. When I saw Barron Trump sitting there, it was like Luca was staring back at me. The same age, the same quiet strength. It brought everything back. Maria placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. But Barron isn't Luca, Antonio. He's just a boy who didn't deserve what you did. While Antonio wrestled with his guilt, Barron sat in his hotel room scrolling through headlines. He paused on one. Barron Trump, snubbed, a lesson in grace. He sighed. The story wasn't about his reaction. It was about Antonio's rejection. "Why do people make things bigger than they are?" he muttered. One of his Secret Service guards, James, knocked softly before entering. "Barron, I thought you'd like to know. People have been sending flowers and letters to the restaurant. Support for the chef, actually." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Support for him?" James nodded. "Some say he must have had a personal reason. They're trying to understand him." Barron sat up straighter. "Maybe. I should try to understand him too." James hesitated. "Do you want us to arrange something?" Barron shook his head. "No need for the guards. I'll write him a letter, something simple." That night, Barron penned a heartfelt note. He kept it brief but meaningful. "Dear Chef Antonio, I don't know your story, but I could tell you were hurting. I hope one day you can find peace. You remind me that everyone has something they're carrying. Take care." Barron. He folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. The next morning, Maria walked into the restaurant carrying a package. "Antonio, this came for you," she said, placing the envelope on his desk. Antonio, exhausted from a sleepless night, frowned. "What is it?" "Just open it," Maria urged, her tone curious. Antonio reluctantly tore open the envelope. As he read Barron's letter, his hands began to tremble. The words felt like a balm and a wound all at once. He read it again, slower this time, and then folded it carefully. "Are you okay?" Maria asked. Antonio nodded, but tears welled in his eyes. "He didn't have to do this," he whispered. "He should hate me, but instead—" Maria smiled softly. "It's a reminder that forgiveness can be more powerful than anger." Antonio's voice cracked. "He's just a kid, Maria, and I let my grief turn him into a target." For the first time in years, Antonio felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift. Antonio decided he couldn't hide anymore. The restaurant was half empty, the staff on edge. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the dining room. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" he called out. The chatter stopped as all eyes turned to him. His hands trembled, but he spoke clearly. "I want to address what happened yesterday with Barron Trump. My actions were wrong, and there's no excuse for them." A few gasps echoed through the room. Antonio continued, his voice breaking. "I let my pain cloud my judgment. Barron didn't deserve my anger. I was selfish, and I hurt someone who showed nothing but grace." The staff exchanged glances, and some guests nodded in understanding. Antonio stepped back, his head bowed. "I can't undo what I did, but I can promise to do better. I'm truly sorry." The room was silent for a moment before soft applause began. Maria, standing nearby, gave him a proud nod. As Antonio returned to the kitchen, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of hope. 2 days later, Antonio was prepping ingredients when Maria burst into the kitchen. "You're not going to believe this," she said, breathless. Antonio turned, confused. "What's going on?" Maria grinned. "Barron Trump is here, and he wants to talk to you." Antonio's heart dropped. "What?" "No, I can't." But before he could finish, Barron stepped into the kitchen, flanked by his guards. He smiled politely, his presence calm yet commanding. "Chef Antonio," he said, extending a hand. Antonio froze, staring at the young man he had wronged. Slowly, he reached out and shook Barron's hand. "You didn't have to come here," Antonio stammered. Barron shrugged. "I wanted to. I read your apology. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Antonio's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you. You remind me of my son, and I—" Barron interrupted gently. "We all carry something. I just wanted to let you know I forgive you." Antonio broke down, the weight of years of guilt pouring out. Barron patted his shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Chef." As Barron walked out, the entire staff watched in awe. Barron's visit to the restaurant became the talk of the town. News outlets and social media exploded with headlines like, "Barron Trump forgives," "Chef Antonio in an emotional meeting." Antonio, overwhelmed by the attention, stayed in the kitchen, avoiding interviews. However, the story of Barron's kindness resonated deeply with people around the world. It wasn't about his fame. It was about his heart. At the restaurant, flowers, letters, and messages of support poured in. Some were for Barron, others for Antonio. One note stood out to Antonio, left by a customer. "Forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. Thank you for showing us that it's never too late to change." Antonio held the note in his hands, his eyes wet. It felt like Luca's spirit was speaking to him through these strangers. But Antonio knew his journey wasn't over. He couldn't just move on. He had to do something meaningful, not just for himself, but to honor his son's memory. That night, as Antonio sat in his quiet apartment, he made a decision that would change his life and his restaurant forever. Antonio gathered his staff the next morning. The air in the room was tense as everyone waited for him to speak. "I've made a decision," Antonio said, his voice steady but emotional. "This restaurant has always been about exclusivity, luxury, and fame. But I want to change that." The staff exchanged surprised glances. "What do you mean?" Maria asked. Antonio took a deep breath. "From now on, this restaurant will serve as a space where people from all walks of life can come together. I want to start hosting community nights, dinners for underprivileged kids, families struggling to make ends meet." The room fell silent. Then Maria clapped, and soon the entire staff joined in. "That's a beautiful idea," Maria said, smiling through tears. Antonio nodded. "It's what Luca would have wanted, and it's my way of giving back, of making things right." Word of Antonio's plan spread quickly. Barron, hearing about it, sent another letter. "Chef Antonio, your decision is inspiring. Luca would be proud. If there's ever a way I can help, let me know." Barron Antonio framed the letter and hung it in the restaurant. It became a symbol of hope, forgiveness, and the power of change. The day of the first community dinner arrived. The once exclusive restaurant was transformed. Long tables replaced the private booths, and the staff buzzed with energy. Families and children from the local shelters and community centers arrived, their eyes wide with wonder. Antonio stood at the entrance, personally greeting each guest. He felt nervous but excited. Maria handed him an apron, teasing, "Let's see if you still remember how to cook for more than 10 people." The kitchen came alive with laughter. On purpose, Antonio prepared simple yet delicious meals, pouring his heart into every dish. The smell of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces filled the air. As Antonio served a plate to a young boy, the child looked up and said, "Thank you, Chef." His small voice reminded Antonio of Luca, and for the first time in years, the memory didn't hurt. It felt warm. The night ended with a round of applause from the guests. Antonio stood for them, his voice trembling as he said, "Thank you for giving me the chance to do something meaningful. This is only the beginning." And it truly was. Months later, Antonio received a call that left him stunned. "Baron Trump would like to visit your restaurant for the next community dinner." The voice on the other end said. When the night arrived, Barron walked into the restaurant surrounded by his guards. But this time, there was no tension, only smiles and excitement. Antonio greeted him warmly. "Baron, thank you for coming. It means more than you know." Barron smiled. "I wanted to see how everything turned out, and I thought it'd be nice to help out tonight if that's okay." Antonio blinked, surprised. "Help? You mean in the kitchen?" Barron nodded. "Why not?" That evening, Barron rolled up his sleeves and joined Antonio in the kitchen. They cooked side by side, sharing stories and even laughter. The staff watched in awe, touched by the genuine bond forming between the two. When dinner was served, Barron joined the guests, sitting at the long tables and chatting with the children. He treated everyone like equals, and by the end of the night, the room was filled with joy. Antonio knew this was Luca's spirit at work. Months turned into years, and Antonio's restaurant became a beacon of hope in the city. People traveled from far and wide, not for its exclusivity, but for its heart. Antonio renamed the restaurant Luca's Table in honor of his son. Every week, community dinners were held, and the walls were filled with photos of smiling guests. Barron remained a frequent visitor. He often brought donations, ideas, and even cooked meals. Over time, Antonio and Barron became close friends. One evening, after a particularly lively community dinner, Antonio and Barron sat outside the restaurant. The stars twinkled above as Antonio said, "You've changed my life, Barron." Barron smiled. "No, Chef, you changed mine. You taught me that even in pain, there's room for kindness." As the years passed, Luca's Table became more than a restaurant. It became a legacy of forgiveness, love, and second chances. Antonio finally found peace, and Barron became a symbol of humility and compassion. And somewhere, Luca was smiling. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts about kindness, forgiveness, and second chances. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that inspire. Let's spread the message of love and hope together.